Hello, I'm Aditya. Thanks for being here. Here, where we examine ideas from different angles, including the uncomfortable, the unpopular, and sometimes the contrarian. Not to be difficult, but to be honest. Because the best ideas are not the ones that sound good at first, they're the ones that still hold up after real scrutiny. Let's get started.
Today we are talking about the story trap, why we mistake narrative for truth. What if one of the biggest human advantages is also one of our biggest vulnerabilities? Because humans don't just enjoy stories, we use them to decide what is real. And that sounds harmless unless you notice something slightly alarming. The best story in the room is very often not the truest one. It's just the one with the best timing, the clearest villain, and the emotional maturity of a flamethrower. And to be fair, this isn't because humans are irrational in some cartoonish way. Storytelling is ancient survival tech. For most of human history, if someone told you, "Don't go near that river, something bad happened there," you did not demand a spreadsheet. You listened, you remembered, you lived. Story was fast, story was portable, story was memory with handles. That's the steel man here. Narrative is not the enemy. Narrative helped humans coordinate, teach, remember, bond, and survive. Stories compress experience into something we can actually carry around in our heads. A story can teach caution faster than data. It can transmit values faster than philosophy. So the issue is not that stories exist. The issue is when we quietly promote them from guide to judge. Because once story becomes a judge, a very dangerous thing happens. We stop asking, is this true? And start asking, does this fit the story I already believe? That is a pivot. At that point, evidence is no longer evidence. It's just raw material for whichever narrative is already running your internal operating system. And once that happens, you are not thinking freely, you are being narrated. Why are stories so powerful? Because stories do several jobs at once. They tell us what happened, why it happened, who matters, who is at fault, what should be feared, and what someone like you is supposed to do next. That is an incredible amount of psychological force in a compact little package. A chart gives you information, a story gives you identity. And identity beats information more often than people like to admit. This is where modern life gets dangerous. Because we now live in an environment where narrative is being produced, optimized, weaponized, and distributed at industrial scale. Not just by media, not just by brands, not just by ambitious institutions, by everyone with a platform, an agenda, a product, a grievance, a movement, or a monetization strategy. Which is a very long way of saying the market has discovered that we are highly programmable through story. And the hijack works because stories don't merely tell you facts. They give you belonging. They tell you who the good people are, who the bad people are, what the stakes are, and why asking inconvenient questions feel vaguely disloyal. The last part matters because the most effective narratives do not say, "Here is evidence, evaluate it." They say, "Here is meaning, join us." That is much stronger. This is how people end up acting against their own interests. Not because they are bribed, not because they are unusually foolish, usually because they have been absorbed into a story where sacrifice feels virtuous, doubt feels shameful, and contradiction feels like betrayal. And once a narrative fuses with your identity, correcting it no longer feels like learning. It feels like losing part of yourself. Which is why bad narratives are so risky. They aren't just beliefs, they are shelter. A company does not mainly sell a product, it sells a lifestyle, a tribe, a value system, a moral atmosphere. It tells you buying this thing means you are not just consuming, you are expressing taste, courage, discernment, rebellion, refinement, authenticity, or some other very flattering noun. And that's elegant because once a transaction becomes story about who you are, the price becomes secondary. Media systems do something similar. They don't just report events, they frame them. Framing is where narrative sneaks in wearing a respectable jacket. What gets emphasized? What gets omitted? Who is centered? Who becomes a symbol? Which one case becomes the case? A single vivid story can dominate public attention far more easily than a mountain of representative data. Not because it is more important, because it is more memorable. Those are not the same thing. And institutions of every kind, ideological, commercial, cultural, know that humans are highly responsible to stories with three ingredients: moral clarity, emotional charge, a villain. That formula is almost unfairly effective. Give people a story with those three features, and many will stop checking whether the underlying claim is representative, scalable, or even remotely true. Because stories don't just answer curiosity, they soothe uncertainty. And people will forgive a lot in exchange for certainty. So what's the alternative? Not becoming some cold machine who interrupts family dinner to discuss sampling bias. Tempting occasionally, but no. The alternative is not to reject stories, it is to demote them. A story should be signal, a starting point, a human window into an issue, but it should never be the final quote of truth. The phrase I like is this: let story open the door, let evidence walk through first. So how do you actually resist narrative hijack in real life? Start with one simple rule. Never confuse an anecdote with a distribution. A story can tell you that something happened. It cannot tell you how often it happens. It can tell you that one person suffered, succeeded, failed, or overcame. It cannot tell you whether that case is typical. That missing piece, compared to what, is where reality usually lives. And sadly, compared to what is not a sentence that trends well online. Second habit, follow the source, not just the story. If a claim is emotionally powerful, pause before merging with it. Ask, where did this come from? Who is selling it? What do they gain if I believe it? Is this original reporting, second-hand commentary, or recycled performance? Is the headline doing all the work while the actual evidence quietly goes missing? A lot of modern persuasion survives because people evaluate the feeling of a claim, not the chain of custody. Third, learn just enough statistics to defend your brain. Not advanced mathematics, just basic civic self-defense. You should know how to ask, what's the base rate? What's the denominator? How big is the sample? Is it representative? What's being compared? And is this absolute risk or relative risk? Because without that, you are walking into a world built on persuasive numbers with no armor on. And persuasive numbers love the unarmored. Fourth, watch your emotional acceleration. If a piece of content makes you instantly furious, instantly righteous, instantly terrified, or instantly smug, that is exactly when your standard should rise. Because emotional heat is often not a product of the message. It is the delivery system. If something seems designed to shut down your curiosity and replace it with certainty, caution is warranted. That is not cynicism, that's maintenance. Fifth, ask what the story is asking you to ignore. Every strong narrative highlights some facts and hides others. So ask, what would weaken the story if it were true? What evidence would the storyteller prefer I never examine? What trade-offs are being edited out? What complexity is being treated like heresy? Good thinking does not begin when you find a story you like. It begins when you identify the costs of liking it too much. And this, I think, is the deepest danger. When people become governed by narrative rather than reality, they become easy to steer. Not because they lack intelligence, because intelligence itself is no protection. If it is employed in service of a story you are emotionally committed to defending. Smart people can become unbelievably creative when asked to rationalize something comforting. A gifted mind inside a bad narrative is not a solution. It is an accelerator. So yes, listen to stories. Stories humanize, they teach, they connect us, they make reality easier to carry. But don't kneel before them, because the world is not always dramatic. It is often statistical, probabilistic, messy, full of noise, incentive trade-offs, and inconvenient denominators. And truth, unlike story, does not always arrive with a soundtrack. If a narrative tells you exactly who to fear, why you're right, why your side is pure, and why you should stop asking questions, you may not have found meaning, you may have found a leash.